Okay, thank you. I'm going to get started. My name is Carly Sakis. I'm the Chief Insights Officer at Isentia. I'm joined by Nairi Crawford, who is the Head of Insights in New Zealand and the lead researcher for our leadership series. Hi Nairi, how are you?
Nice.
Excited to talk about your research yet again.
My favourite thing to talk about at the moment.
Yeah, we've had lots of a great reaction to Leading Through Crisis. We're delighted that you can join us today. We have really designed these case studies and the webinar to really try and find what works for communicators, for what our PR and media colleagues can take from this. We hope it's valuable for you. We hope it's interesting. Today, I'm going to look at leadership in the news in general. We're going to start by looking at what we're talking about when we talk about leadership in the news and the narratives around leaders. We'll start talking about that in a general sense. We'll then really look at what our key findings were for our first and second edition of our leadership series. Edition 1 came out in November last year. Edition 2 came out in March this year. And there are some really distinct findings that came out of those reports that actually inform how people can lead through crisis and really help to inform PR and comms professionals about the opportunities that are out there in terms of leveraging your leadership potential, but also leveraging communications tools available to you. When we look at the news, our news feeds on an individual basis or through our professional news feeds, we see this vast array of leadership styles on display. The last year and a half, we've really seen some very, very compelling versions of leadership on and off the sporting field. We've seen Donald Trump in the US really leading authentically, leading by being himself, connecting directly to his audience, building his audience through Twitter. We see some really interesting things in the way that Trump is leading. We've seen a really interesting leadership battle and leadership complications around the Brexit negotiations with Theresa May and Boris Johnson. We've seen the Royal Banking Commission. For those of you who are joining from Australia, we've seen a very prolonged Royal Commission into banking. And that really put the leaders of our big four banks and our banks in the media spotlight and under scrutiny. And we really saw the good, the bad and the ugly through that, as we do in most days from the newspaper, our television and on social media. In the sporting field, we saw Taylor Harris, who's photoed here from the women's AFL. We saw her kick this incredible goal on the sporting field, but what this photo actually triggered was a really big debate about how high-profile people actually handle trolls on social media and how sports people and athletes can actually drive community engagement and trigger discussions and debates about equality and social issues. We've also seen the recent climate protests led by a 16-year-old Greta, who's pictured there. So we got to thinking really, Nairi, about how important leadership is in the news and how much of a role it plays in what we see. Obviously, after the Christchurch mosque attacks in March this year, we had a very, very powerful image of what image looked like. And this was really played out by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and the international media response to the way she led through the Christchurch attacks. We were already looking at leadership throughout the last year, and when the Christchurch attacks occurred, we really couldn't not analyse her leadership style. We were asked by Prinz and a few clients to really have a look at what was so compelling about Ardern's reaction. Is it something that is unique to her, or are there something that everybody can learn in the way to lead and communicate through a crisis? So that's really what brings us here to be looking at leadership in general, and certainly leadership in the news. We hope that by looking at this, we're looking at really tips and tricks to pass on, and we're looking at really the key narratives and the key lessons that we can learn in terms of what good looks like. When we turn from the news and turn from these big narratives and images of leaders in what we see in media, and we really assess it on a personal level, on how we feel about our own boss, how we feel about leading our own team, it gets complicated really quickly. Some of the best work that we've found coming out on leadership specifically is coming out of Harvard Business Publishing and a book that was released late last year called The Mind of the Leader. And the Mind of the Leader includes research that was done on 35,000 employees, and that includes 250 C-level executives. And the currents and trends and thoughts that we have around leadership are so amusing, but also very, very complex. So let's have a look at their key headlines that came out of this research. So one of the things that came out was that 88% of employees find their leaders disengaging. Not a great stat. And that's coupled with 77% of leaders believe that they are engaging. So it's certainly sobering when you look at your own leadership styles and you look at how that last team meeting went. We've certainly got some stats that really show that we could be doing better in terms of being role models and leading our people. My favourite statistic, though, is 65% of us would forego a pay rise just to see their boss fired. So when we put all of this together and we have a look at how we feel about leadership in our own lives, the role models that have inspired us during our careers, but also the complex nature of leadership, we really thought it was something worth analysing. We really wanted to explore further, delve into the positive and negative messages around leaders and how leadership can be used as an opportunity for PR and communications. In our last edition of the leadership series, edition 2, we actually had this theory that we were trying to tease out. We were looking at the concept of whether leadership had been disrupted. And when we talk about this, we were really talking about comparing the top corporate CEOs of Australia and New Zealand up against a new type of leader that was driving a new narrative about how to lead, how to communicate. We really had a suspicion that there were different rules at play for the likes of Jack Ma from Alibaba, the likes of Mike Cannon-Brookes from Atlassian, compared to those of Alan Joyce from Qantas, Andrew Mackenzie from BHP, that perhaps the media and public had different standards on what we expect, but that this new wave of agile, diverse and dynamic leaders was actually showing us a little bit about what good could look like and how you could build an audience and be more relatable as a CEO from a disruptor company. So we looked at, we explored disruptors. We found that there were some very, very key differences from the ways that CEOs in corporate Australia and corporate New Zealand were actually approaching their audiences and communicating. And this really got played out on social media. It was the very, very critical differences were played out on social. Let's have a look at the worst case scenario now. And I'm going to remind you a little bit about what good looks like and what bad looks like. So I call this tweet from Elon Musk the $20 million tweet. This is obviously a tweet that Musk took a big risk in sending. He broke SEC guidelines and was fined for misleading investors with this. And this is really, I guess, for me, a symbol of when that charismatic disruptor, entrepreneur, takes it a little bit too far, and we can see the consequences of the way that these new type of leaders communicate, and there are serious consequences in the level of risk that they're prepared to take. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we have the likes of Mike Cannon-Brookes from Atlassian, and this is in 2017. There was a really interesting exchange between Cannon-Brookes and Musk about Tesla actually helping with South Australia's energy issues. And we found this a really interesting case study because it showed how new leaders, these disruptors and entrepreneurs, A, are charismatic, but B, they're actually being influential on a whole new scale. They're talking directly to each other in front of us, so there's a high degree of transparency in their conversations. They're ambitious, but they're also trying to influence policy and get things done by a different way. And when we look at the massive differences between corporate leaders, top CEOs from our top 150 companies, and the disruptors. The key difference here is that corporate leaders are mostly invisible on social media platforms, while the disruptors use it to change the world. From a communications angle, we can see this obvious difference. Really big clues on how to engage, build audiences, and communicate effectively. And our stats that you can see on screen here show that 76% of CEOs from Australia's top companies are not on Twitter, while 69% have no activity or followers on LinkedIn, and 26% have no connections on LinkedIn. Only 5% are classified by LinkedIn as being LinkedIn influencers. These are the stats that came out of edition 1. We found them to be astounding at the time, but when we compared them with our charismatic, agile disruptors and how much they were using social to really drive change, it really gave us some big clues on the differences, and really some clues on some opportunities that might exist for corporate leaders. We have one group of leaders who have clearly decided not to engage on social, while the new guard of disruptors are using it to connect with each other and governments to drive business and change the world. Now, obviously, a lot of the disruptors and the entrepreneurs are incredibly charismatic. They're used to telling their story, and they tell very, very compelling stories. And I think, Nari, I wouldn't mind getting you to add a little bit about what we found in addition to. You were the lead researcher on that project. We found that, I guess, our summary was that disruptors were telling better stories. Do you think we can see that day to day in media?
I think it's certainly for disruptors, they are very much in charge of their own stories, and social assets help them do that. I think one of the tricky things about corporate leadership and social media is that it is associated with a huge amount of risk. And we know that that is the thing that corporate leaders are the most scared of, and boards are the most afraid of, is the potential for you know, a $20 million tweet disaster.
Yeah, boards love boring.
Yeah, right. They do. And I think it's, for me, I've positioned a lot of this as more like a spectrum. An unfortunate spectrum of pot plant to Elon Musk. You don't necessarily want to be on either end of it, but you need to help your leaders move further towards something that is going to create a level of authentic connection. Because one of the things that we know disruptors do really well, they happen to use social to do it. That doesn't mean that's the way they will always do it, or the way that might be appropriate for your leader, but they use it to create connection and to create a platform where they can have authentic interactions with people. And based on the success of that model, there is a connection there between that authenticity and the desire to purchase or hear from or be part of a brand.
That's really interesting. And the research that we did in addition to, we compared what they actually spoke about. And so when you looked at Australian CEOs across a 6 month period, 35% of every time they spoke to media, they spoke about regulation. And their second most frequent topic was their own pay. And I think that when you compare that to the innovation, the stories of strategy and growth that we're hearing from some of the more entrepreneurial, disruptive leaders, it's that this story that's so much more compelling about the idea of being, I guess, a victim of disruption as well, and that idea of reducing staff and talking about quite much more of a negative story.
Yeah, I think pay actually exemplifies this difference too. Is that a corporate CEO constantly has to defend their own pay. Bezos doesn't really have to defend that he's the richest man in the world.
He gets celebrated by many. Yeah.
So there's something in the idea that if you are the front, you can be the front person of a brand, but if you are inherently linked to it and you are the person driving that connection, the idea that you deserve your place and you deserve what you're worth and all of those things, that narrative is associated with those people rather than someone that you don't see.
Absolutely. So extending that forward, that research also showed that our CEOs of the top corporate companies are positioned by their organizations to respond to negative news 3 times more than disruptive leaders. So they're in that role of playing defense, rather than telling that compelling growth story. So that leads us on to getting to, I guess, the heart of edition 3, which is really focused on 4 crisis case studies. And we're asking the question, what does leadership through crisis look like right now? And the case studies that we're going to skip through today, Mark Zuckerberg's leadership through Facebook's trials and tribulations, the Boeing crisis. We'll have a look at Raylene Castle's leadership through Rugby Australia's issue after Israel Folau posted a controversial post on Instagram earlier this year. And then we'll close up by looking at Prime Minister Ardern, the way that she was perceived before and after the Christchurch attacks, and then close off with things that we can learn from all 4, things that are common, that are noteworthy, and some tips and tricks, I guess, to take away. So let's really start looking at Facebook. And really, when we're talking about Facebook going through crisis, we're talking about the last 18 months. And I think there's been so much commentary around their response to privacy issues, their response to the Cambridge Analytica story, and really increasingly their response to inappropriate content being on their platform. And obviously, we're from the Insights team now. We look at things through numbers. What I found really interesting about Facebook's reaction from a very high level was that the Cambridge Analytica story broke globally in 2018, but it was actually publicly available. All of that information was publicly available in December 2015, and they're widely criticised by taking 5 days to respond in 2018. But when you really analyse the numbers, they've taken 3 years and 5 days to get in front of that story. And I think one of the things that your research has really shown is that how you respond in those first few moments, those first 2 days, perhaps after something really breaks globally or is a solid issue for you, sets the tone and sets the narrative on how you're portrayed throughout the whole thing. And it is incredibly hard to repivot that narrative and change it as time goes on. People will always hark back to these 5 days where Facebook was silent. That's still a very, very big part of the way that they're written up. Obviously, after that 5 days, $100 billion was wiped from their market cap. I guess also that really prompted the US government, the UK government, New Zealand Parliament, Australian government to really demand answers from CEO Mark Zuckerberg. And that's where we saw him in front of the US Senate. We saw him really, I guess, uncomfortably try and explain his business to the outsider. From a news perspective, and when we talk about crisis, we talk about trying to contain it, trying to give time-bound responses, fast, firm, believable responses. This issue has been in the news for 1,399 days now. It continues to really pester Facebook in terms of media coverage and the way that their leadership is portrayed. It's something that I think we've learned a lot through analysing Zuckerberg in particular. Let's go a little bit through and look at, I guess, what the research that we conducted really highlighted. What really shone through is that Mark Zuckerberg hasn't really evolved the way that we probably expected him to in terms of keeping up with Facebook's growth and their immense power. And I think one of the single biggest critical message around Zuckerberg over this time was that he had failed to adequately acknowledge the immense power Facebook had. So we see him really not so much acknowledging that with great power comes great responsibility. And you can all see on the screen here, we've got this very natural tech leader on the left, and we've got this really unnatural, awkward, robot-looking leader on the right, which is really how he's increasingly being portrayed in media. And really your research in the report, which everyone on the call will receive in the next 2 days, we really see that you can have this halo around your leadership and your business until you're too big, right? Is that really how you would summarize it, Nai?
Yeah, I think, and I chose the Spider-Man quote with great power comes great responsibility on purpose, mostly because I think it is really fascinating how you are a disruptor until you're not. So you have that, you're afforded all of those kind of wonderful narratives, and you can be really upfront and you can, wear a t-shirt and jeans
all of those kind of things. And then very quickly you get to a point where your company is big enough and has enough global influence that there is an expectation on you to not necessarily lead charismatically, but the issue with Zuckerberg is that he actively avoids being that leader. So the narrative around him is actually really outside of potentially not being a human being, which if you have a spare 10 minutes today, do Google Zuckerberg because it is worth it. But it is about the fact that he's just not there. He doesn't show up and he doesn't front unless he's legally required to by a government. He's generally only speaking when they are specific Facebook events. There is a lot of his other members of his executive team are sometimes put out instead of him, but then the narrative is, well, why isn't he here and why isn't he fronting? And that's not necessarily indicative of an inability of him to be able to front the issues, but it's that it feels like he doesn't want to, and it feels like he doesn't want to take that responsibility on and acknowledge the incredible amount of power that Facebook has in everybody's life, and government and privacy, and how they set the agenda for all of these things.
Yeah, that's right. So the research really shone through that he hasn't evolved in terms of acknowledging the immense power and size of Facebook, but also he is absent from where we want to see him. And that includes, he wasn't there in that 5 days after Cambridge Analytica broke, that the general counsel for Facebook took on those for that first reaction. He wasn't there in the Christchurch call meetings in Paris. He wasn't there in the UN General Assembly meetings a few weeks ago. In these really big moments that we want to see him front and center, he's been notably absent. And I think that has really set the narrative. And the reason why we can see, I guess, some really unfavorable coverage coming through. So in the research, you can see that 8%, there was only 8% of all media coverage that described him favorably. And when we took a deep dive into why that 8% was positive, it was really about his not-for-profit work, his philanthropy. There were no other really positive attributes that shone through. I guess more importantly, though, more than 35% of coverage categorized him as ineffective and dishonest. And I think that that's a huge thing to have to combat when you go through a crisis, because you need to have that trust, and you need to be seen as an effective leader going into them. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but they're really damaging traits to go into a crisis with. Images, obviously, you analysed all images that went through that, because we believe that's a powerful way to communicate as well. He was obviously positioned as robotic and awkward in a lot of memes, and I think that's what the case studies that we've pulled together highlights, that if you get leading through crisis right, you're an international superstar. Get it wrong, and this type of depiction will come up. And I think that at the heart of all these memes, and I think Nairi is right, spend 10 minutes Googling Zuckerbot today. You won't be disappointed. There's some really funny, clever things up there, but the underlying theme of all this is his unnaturalness as the leader that Facebook perhaps needs, or the leader that we expect now, that there's incredibly robotic evolution in terms of his style. So we think that really when you respond, how you respond, and the effectiveness of your actions after a crisis are incredibly pivotal to building trust and repairing your reputation. And these are all the ingredients that were somewhat lacking in Facebook's journey over the last sort of year and a little bit. I'm going to now move on to talk about the Boeing case study, and this is a case study that will be one of those classic PR sort of crisis in comms case studies. I think that university courses will pick it up because it is just so textbook. For me, it is surprising that we had so many things go wrong with the communications around Boeing in this day and age, because I think that these are 101 type crisis comms issues that weren't executed well. But we'll unpack it a little bit in the next few minutes. So when we're talking about the Boeing crisis in the report and the research, we're really talking about the consequences of two plane crashes. The first Lion Air crash in October last year, and the second Ethiopian Airlines in earlier this year. We're talking about 346 lives lost. So a really, really devastating human tragedy. When we look at response times and we look at Facebook getting criticised for 5 days after Cambridge Analytica, we look at the first in-depth response that we get from Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg was 26 days after the second plane crash. And I think that, yes, they did come out on the day and they issued statements, but they didn't actually allow their CEO to be questioned by media up until that time. And we'll go a little bit into what impact that can have, the pros and cons of that. 4.1 billion in lost revenue so far from Boeing being grounded, and obviously so many consequences in terms of class action lawsuits coming up. So just one of them includes 3,000 pilots from 12 airlines. Obviously, families of the victims are also pursuing their legal avenues to make sure that there's, I guess, justice for those victims. Let's have a look, though, at how their CEO Muilenburg was portrayed before the plane crashes. And I think that it's really interesting. I always love these stories about the CEO that starts as the intern. And Muilenburg has that lovely sort of, lovely dedication to the industry in his company. Started at Boeing as the intern, worked his way up to CEO. At the time of the first crash, Boeing is absolutely he's delivering an exceptional financial performance. We're talking about a net profit was up by 24%. Commercial aircraft profits were up 45% year on year. He was loved by shareholders. Things have obviously definitely turned, and I think just in the last week, this issue is really evolving rapidly as we speak. But in the last week, he's obviously been stood down as chairman, and is just CEO now. And has been incredibly scathing criticism of his leadership throughout. What you can see on the screen now is when I mentioned that there was an in-depth response 26 days after the second crash, this is what they actually led with. And I find it really interesting decision to lead with a video to Twitter. On the one hand, you think that's really great, that's really good thinking, let's get it out there. But really, this came under a heavy criticism because it didn't give media a chance to question him directly. And I think that when lives have been lost, when our safety is at stake, when you're in a type of highly regulated industry where you definitely cannot fail fast, you actually have to give your media, your stakeholders, and your public that chance to ask questions. And this type of communication, while I think there's a lot of merit in it, didn't give media enough time to question and get him talking organically about it. So a real darling leading up to the disaster, and he really has come up under some heavy criticism throughout the last few months. Let's just look at how he was portrayed in media. The majority of coverage that we analysed positioned him as defensive and dishonest, and I think he was very evasive throughout that whole crisis as well. Only 3% of coverage considered him to have a positive attribute, and that was that he was regretful. So we're really talking about some very heavy criticism. 44% of all coverage actually directly criticised him as a leader, and I think this is definitely what you need to avoid going into a crisis, about your leader becoming the story. But this is something that we really felt that showing up physically in a crisis, showing up emotionally in a crisis becomes incredibly important. And that's one of the key things that we learn through the Boeing crisis. Nari, I'm interested in your analysis here. Obviously, when something as serious as a plane crashing occurs, I mean, many of us work in highly regulated industries, emergency services, police, crisis, evacuations, those sorts of things. There's not much you can say in those early hours of a crisis, yet everybody wants you to come out and say something. What would you advocate in that scenario with a lens on the Boeing case study?
Yeah, the Boeing case study is actually my favourite one, which is a strange thing to say about what is essentially plane crashes. But
because we know that a corporate environment and anything that's a highly regulated environment as well is so risk averse. But the issue here is that if you are so risk averse to the point that you are absent, or that you won't indicate anything, the absence just creates speculation. So, because one of the interesting narratives around Muhlenberg is that obviously he was really loved by shareholders. He's now being sued by the same shareholders. Well, Boeing are being sued by the same shareholders, and that's an incredibly steep decline in terms of approval. But I think it's the absence and the defensiveness that in the way that they communicated. Obviously, there's a huge range of processes that have to be gone through when events like this happen, and we know that it's highly regulated. We know there's only so many things that you can say until there's all of the data. But to not say anything and to be so concerned about the financial impact of saying we don't know yet, or we are investigating this and we're taking it very seriously and we still don't have all of the answers, but should anything happen, this is what we think we're going to do. The complete fear around the financial impact of that, I think, has proven in hindsight to not have been the right play, because the financial impact of all of that speculation is so much worse. Yeah. The fact that it was a forced grounding, it caused it brought into question their relationship with the FAA. It became this narrative that they couldn't control around Boeing that looks so sinister and disingenuous and commercially motivated, and whether or not they cut corners and whether or not they ignored feedback, all of those things were just able to be investigated without any contribution from Boeing. So it really significantly shifted how that narrative played out.
It's really interesting. I think that when you look at the language used by Muhlenberg as well as Zuckerberg when they responded, both came out with, I think, powerful language about owning up to it. That I think Zuckerberg came out saying, it's my company, I started it, I own it. When you look at the language that Muhlenberg came out with earlier in the piece, it was about I own it, but none of the other actions actually told us that. Zuckerberg went missing on key moments, but also Muhlenberg didn't have that fast, believable action to follow up on. So, and lacked a whole lot of empathy. It looked like legal was running the show.
You can't retrofit empathy. And Boeing is definitely an example of that. The empathy narrative didn't start for them, I think, until around June.
Yeah, they have evolved, right? They're now using different language. That's one of the most interesting things about the case study, that they seem to have learned a lot on the way. And I think Muhlenberg actually says we've learned a lot. It's not an industry where we want you to be learning on the go. We want you to come fully fit for that role. So some really interesting findings from Boeing. Obviously, a lot more detail in the report. It goes into a deep dive of the timeline, but also the narratives and the key messages around all of those things. Going to go very quickly now through our last two case studies. We've obviously done a very, very in-depth study of Rugby Australia, and with a particular focus on their CEO, Raylene Castle's approach and how she was, I guess, how she approached the communications through that and how she fared through that. And when you look at Rugby Australia issue, and we look at response times, right? So something so critical in a crisis. We're not talking about days anymore. We're talking about hours. So Israel Folau put up the Instagram post. Rugby Australia came out within about 3 hours of that going up, and that sets this narrative throughout the whole 97,000 media items that have followed that one, that they are swift, that they are decisive, that they are strategic, that they are responsive. And I think that was all built in that first 3 hours. What I really loved about what they came out in those first 3 hours, or that first day, is they gave Folau 48 hours. So all of their communication in that early time was swift, but also time bound, right? So this idea that you come out to media really early, even if you don't have much to say, but you tell media and stakeholders when they will see you next. And that gives you time for more preparation, but it also gives you your stakeholders, your audience, a lot of reassurance about the fact that you're on top of this and that they'll see you again. Since this story broke, we've had 1,742 hours of radio and television coverage on the issue, 97,000 media items, and obviously a massive peak of coverage on the day that Folau and Rugby Australia went into the Fair Work Commission. We had 6,700 stories in one day. So to say that they've been under a media spotlight is absolutely not really giving it justice. Massive amount of pressure. When we look at this in terms of a very modern crisis, we see Castle come out of it quite well. We see that 40% of media coverage was positive, and the words and the phrases and the traits that she was really praised for was her calmness, her clear response, but really specifically for being inclusive, decisive, and strategic. And we see that there's this idea that the Folau incident has shifted the narrative of Castle somewhat. She was part of the problem before, and perhaps taking a hard line in the sand moment here and really defending the cultural values and the policies of Rugby Australia that's in tune with a lot of Australians' beliefs really has worked well. Obviously, this issue has got so many twists and turns. It continues. It will continue throughout up to 2020 to really capture our imaginations, but also capture media attention. One of the things that we think is really important about this case study is the media interest alone. And that is that this actually is a risk that most organisations carry. We're talking here about a potential conflict between your employees, their rights, their values, what they want, how they want to express themselves on social media, as opposed to your cultural values, your policies, and I guess what your company stands for. And I think that that's something that could potentially any organisation can be implicated in that conflict. Rugby Australia has absolutely faced it in a strongest possible stance against homophobia and the like, but it actually has the potential to impact most organisations, because we have this huge issue of religious freedom up against, I guess, employee contracts and rules. What the research found was that Rugby Australia and the words and the language that they used around the crisis was very skilled in terms of containing it and bringing it from this huge sensitive issue of religious freedom back to a specific breach of an employee or a player conduct. And I think every time they've spoken in the media, they've actually tried to tailor it and contain it down to one person and one isolated incident, and not enter into this huge debate about religious freedom. So a very, very tight and hard line to walk, but we believe they've done so quite well from here. So an interesting one for Rugby Australia. Nari, is there anything that you found particularly interesting from the way that they went through this issue to date?
I mean, Rugby Australia did have the advantage of this was not their first rodeo with this particular type of behaviour, and they had the advantage of knowing the public reaction when they were giving him another chance and saying, okay, so we know that this is behaviour that we don't find acceptable, and we've made that clear. What was really good in the response is that it was quick, but the clarity of it as a breach of the code of conduct has been clear throughout. That's never wavered. There's never been, from Rugby Australia and from Castle particularly, there's been no indications that it's anything other than that. This is what it is. This is our position. These are the actions that we've taken. Here's the support of those actions. Here's the process. This is what we believe, which is incredibly. It can be risky in an environment where it's really easy to get that wrapped up in an argument about religious freedom. That will ultimately be a legal precedent decision next year, and that will be incredibly interesting to see what impact that has and how media cover it and how media understand it. But it really is in that clarity and in that quick decision, and the fact that those kind of key beats of how Rugby Australia feel about that never changed.
So interesting, so interesting. So one to keep on watching,
yeah.
I guess. We're now going to turn to the Christchurch attacks as the final, the fourth case study in the report. And just to, I guess, bring us up to speed, obviously, with what we're talking about here, we're talking about Jacinda Ardern's leadership through that. Obviously, the mosque attacks were live streamed on Facebook for 17 minutes. New Zealand police informed Facebook of that. It was removed, the footage was removed within 12 minutes, but in the next 24 hours, Facebook had 1.5 million versions of that video to remove. So an incredible crisis for Facebook, but also New Zealand. 1:40 p.m, the gunman's manifesto was sent. At 1:59 p.m, he was apprehended. And we first saw Ardern speak at 4:20. So her first speech was at 4:20 p.m. So again, we see this really fast response. We see a very, very timely response, and from Facebook, it's got to be said, but also Ardern. And I think that really sets her up nicely for being front and centre of this issue. And really, when you look at the way that her leadership, the language that she chose, the optics that she went with, it really was picked up by international media as something new, a new narrative in leadership, a new narrative on how to deal with terror incidents. And we see these really interesting posts about, you know, a leader with love on full display. You know, this is the empathy that we've been looking for. This is the answer to some of those more divisive leaders like Donald Trump, some of the more, I guess, the more hostile leadership that we've got in Europe and the US at the moment. So this was really, I guess, context played a big part in the international reaction to that. But we see a new leader and a new type of response to crisis emerge. Obviously, the analysis goes into why this was so genuine. Why was this so authentic? Why was this so important to us? And why did we think that this was really done well? And I think one of the most interesting points to me, Nari, is that you, throughout the report, really talk about how she was known for her kindness and her belief that government should be kind and government should show empathy before the crisis. Like, that was what she was well known for, that she was known, I guess, the narrative around her leadership was that she was passionate. There were questions whether she was effective on some domestic policy issues leading up to the crisis, so that it wasn't all roses coming into it. But what she was known for were the key traits that really shone through the media coverage after the crisis. And when we see, you know, right from the beginning, she presents herself as the story, right? So she takes the gunman's name away. We're not going to identify with him. It's my language that's going to set the tone. It's my decisions that are going to be to set the response rather than the act. And I think that that's a really powerful thing, because in every other crisis, we try to avoid the leader becoming the story. In this case, that's flipped to her advantage. And we see that it's a powerful thing. It's a very resolute thing to come out and deliver this first, firm, fast, believable action that she does. So we do see these really innate behaviours to her, like they're very natural to her. We see things that aren't being forced. We see a very, very genuine and authentic approach that was what we knew before the crisis. So a really interesting case study. Nai, is there anything that you'd like to add from your point of view in terms of Ardern's leadership through that? I will bring up the stats now so we can see exactly how well she fared in terms of positive and negative coverage.
Yeah, I think the thing with Ardern is really around the authenticity. So she wasn't displaying traits unknown to her previously. It's just that the way that those traits were considered before were a weakness, whereas in this they were a strength. And I think it's important to understand that because she had built this connection, and that is something that she has had through most of her political career, it did really mean that we weren't analysing the leader behaviour in the same way that we usually would. But the other thing that often gets, I think, forgotten in this type of research is that there was also a significant amount of action that happened. So there was quick legislative change. There was, it was decisive, and it was followed up with, you know, the things that were promised were largely followed up on in this particular case. So that's often not the case post-crisis, is that a lot of things get said and they don't always actually live through the political process, and that wasn't the case with this one, and especially in how she set the tone with language and behaviour, I think was incredibly important to ensuring that
that all of the communities involved were kind of wrapped up in the support that they needed.
Really interesting. And interesting, you can see here on screen that 50% of coverage praised her leadership, but it was more positive in international media. So the international response was incredibly favourable, over and above the Australian New Zealand approach, but still incredibly favourably discussed, empathetic, inclusive, resolute, this visionary type of language coming in. Just now sort of having to wrap up, and I could talk about this literally for forever, but when we wrap up the 4 case studies, we really find some interesting lessons. And I think that, Nari, you say it in the report, audiences demand connection even more than ever before, and content is tailored to the individual now, and that has an impact on the way that we build and reach audiences. I guess the essence that ties all the 4 case studies together is that we want to know you as a leader before a crisis hits, and we want to believe you when the worst happens. So that believability is absolutely pivotal. And when we look at, I guess, the 4 key takeouts that we have for PR and comms, we really feel that leading in crisis requires showing up physically and emotionally. And that's something that when organisations haven't quite been successful through that, something in that has been missing. Secondly, Nari, you've just been speaking about this, crisis demands firm, fast and believable action. And I find that all those 3 need to be present. If one's missing, you're going to have consequences in the way that issue plays out in the media. Thirdly, something that our research continually backs up is that social media remains the biggest opportunity for communicators and leaders to connect with their audiences and stakeholders. There are risks, but I think that we can be a little bit more creative there. And the 4th one is really about how telling better stories, the way that perhaps our disruptive entrepreneur leaders are, telling more compelling stories, telling stories that are more imaginative and perhaps more proactive, can build a foundation so that we can know you, we can know your leaders before a crisis hits, that we know your story, we believe it, so that when something happens, you actually have that authenticity and believability, so that we can really be engaged in what you say and believe you. That is the conclusion to our webinar today. I thank everybody for taking time out of your busy lives to attend. We've really appreciated you coming along. We'll be sending you a copy of the full report. The best part about this research is that it's continually evolving. It's like a choose your own adventure book. So we're always looking for suggestions from you on what topic to tackle next. So we're searching for our next topic now. So if you've got any ideas, questions, or follow-up things, please get in touch with your contact at Isentia, and we'll be definitely keen to connect with you and make sure that we're getting your ideas and taking them on board. A very big thanks to Nori for joining me today. Congratulations on the report. It's fascinating and I think really valuable. Thank you.
My favourite one so far.
Absolutely. Onward and upward. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.